Hi, I'm Angus Kress Gillespie, and this is Old Ways in New Jersey. Previously on Old Ways in New Jersey, we've looked at old houses, old buildings, singers, songwriters, all kinds of interesting things. Today, we're in New Brunswick, New Jersey, on the old Queens campus of Rutgers University, and we're particularly interested in Geology Hall. Now, there's an interesting story behind Geology Hall. The architect was Henry Janeway Hardenberg. And Hardenberg, he grew up in New Brunswick, New Jersey. And between 1865 and 1870, Hardenberg apprenticed himself to an established architect in New York City. In 1871, he returns to New Brunswick, starts his own architectural practice. But it's tough going starting a new practice. He needs some contracts, he needs some work. Fortunately, he had good family connections. It seems like his great-great-grandfather, Jacob Hardenberg, was the first president of Rutgers College. So it was natural that he got his first architectural commissions from Rutgers. He built two buildings for Rutgers on either side of Old Queens, Kirkpatrick Chapel and the building we're currently looking at, which is Geology Hall. Geology Hall was finished in 1872. And interestingly enough, Hardenberg went on to a rather distinguished and famous career. He's known for his building of apartment houses and hotels. For example, he's known for the very famous Dakota apartments on Central Park West, as well as the original Waldorf and Astoria hotels, which were at Fifth Avenue and 34th Street. But they were later demolished in the 20s to make way for the Empire State Building. But now let's take a closer look at the architecture here of Geology Hall. Geology Hall was built in the Romanesque style in 1872, and it's easily identifiable. You see its massive quality. It's very bulky brownstones. Very thick walls, characteristic of the Romanesque style. And the giveaway for Romanesque style, you see all the windows have these round arches, which is characteristic of Romanesque. Sturdy piers, see those sturdy piers on either side of the doorway. And up at top, you see rather large towers, also characteristic. Another identifying attribute of the Romanesque style would be its bilateral symmetry. Whatever's on the left is also on the right, just like the human body in that respect. Fascinating, lovely building. If you use your romantic imagination, you can see how this would have looked in 1872. Very handsome building. Now, the Geological Museum, which we're going to visit, is housed on the second floor, and that has the natural history of New Jersey, a wonderful collection of rocks and minerals, of fossils, Native American artifacts, seashells, and the most spectacular things, I guess, is a 10,000-year-old mastodon from Salem County, New Jersey, as well as a dinosaur trackway from Towaco, New Jersey, zinc minerals from Franklin, New Jersey, and a 30-foot-long geological cross-section of New Jersey in the front foyer.
We're in the lobby of Geological Hall at Rutgers University, and the map behind me is a topographic map that was made in 1893 under the supervision of Dr. Bernie Kummel, who was at the time the state geologist of New Jersey. The map is made out of copper, and it's a series of plates, and if you look at them, you'll see they're about the size of an unfolded page of newspaper. That's because the copper technique was exactly the same one that was used to print papers in those days. Now, when you look at the map itself, you can see off toward the northwest or the upper left corner, it's a very rugged area. Those are the areas of the Appalachians and the Redding Prong. Coming back down a little more toward the southeast or toward the lower right-hand corner, you'll see an area that lies between the Hudson River in the north, and there's a hook shape there, and those are the Watchungs. This is the Piedmont region of New Jersey, And if you were to draw a line from the Hudson River right across New Jersey, pretty much along Route 1, and then down along the lower Delaware past Philadelphia, that's the boundary of the Piedmont with the coastal plain, and of course everything to the southeast is a part of the New Jersey coastal plain.
We're here in the main exhibit space in the Geological Museum of Geological Hall in Rutgers University, and I'm with Bill Selden, who's the collection manager. And Bill, whenever I'm here, I have a sense of the weight of history on my shoulders. I'm thinking of Louis Caleb Beck, who was a geological collector, and then he was succeeded by George Hamel Cook. Can you tell us a little bit about these two guys?
Well, sure. Actually, I think history is our middle name here. These two gentlemen that you mentioned are really pioneers in science. Beck was one of the really earliest workers where science was changing over from sort of natural philosophy, where you talked about it, to actually collecting things and generating data. And then George Cook was the guy that really moved the curriculum of Rutgers into sort of the modern arts and sciences, the liberal arts tradition that we're familiar with today. And neither one of them could have done it without the other. The other historic aspect of this place, I like to think of this whole building as sort of a time machine with at least 3 settings. Yeah. We've got this Victorian structure, which was put up in 1872. We've got an Egyptian mummy around the corner. It is, about 2,300 years old, making it a little less than half as old as civilization. And then we've got the oldest setting, which would be anything that's fossil, which is 10,000 years or older, back to things that are billions of years old.
Yeah, it's like a time machine, and it gives us an awareness of what was called deep time. It goes back so far.
Deep time and a comparison of there's old, older, and oldest, and it's something you kind of lose track of. I know when I was growing up, I always had trouble just keeping these numbers straight, you know. It was hard.
Yeah, of course. Bill, what would you say are the strengths of the Geological Museum?
Well, I'd say the collections are really the core. That's really the reason you have a museum at all, is because you have collections. And that's certainly one of our strengths. We have a collection of minerals and fossils that emphasize the natural history of New Jersey. We have another strength, which is our public outreach programs, where we're trying to work as a bridge between the academic community and the public. And you know, it's really exciting to see how enthusiastic the audiences are when we have our programs. And this is presentations by researchers about their work without the jargon, and the accessibility is really important. People love the excitement of scientific discovery. That's an adventure.
And besides, as a state university, we owe to give something back to the people of New Jersey, not just be in an ivory tower.
Well, that's very true, and Rutgers does quite a few things. I don't know about most of them, but I know about this one, yeah. And I've been doing this for a long time. And you know, one of the things that's really exciting about the history of what this museum does is that it happened because private citizens learned about what was here. They discovered the mineral collections at Rutgers. They put forward the idea of sharing this with the public. And the chairman at the time, a guy named Ray Murray, was receptive to this. And between these people and the academic community, what we do not only serves the need of the public for general scientific information, but we serve a group of people who want something more than that. They're not researchers, but they're avocational scientists, and they have a good background, and they need something a little bit more than what you get in general public talks. We give them that.
Something they can sink their teeth into.
That's right.
Now, we've talked about the building, we've talked about the museum. Perhaps we should share with our viewers a little bit about yourself. I understand you got a master's degree in geology from Wright State out in Ohio?
That's right. I'm from southwestern Ohio. I grew up in what geologists call the Cincinnati Arch, and it's got a lot of fossils in it, and that was sort of where my interest in the whole business started. My master's degree was from Wright State University. It is named after the Wright brothers. They couldn't call themselves the Flyers, though, because the University of Dayton, which is a Catholic school, had already used that name. So I forget what they called themselves, but it was a new program, and I was very fortunate to be there and to enjoy the benefits of that education.
And then I believe you spent some time at Princeton down the road.
Yeah, my career actually started with a summer job at the Smithsonian. I was a newly minted master's, and so I got a job there, and that plugged me into the museum network in the United States. And from there I moved to Princeton, and from Princeton to Rutgers.
Yeah. Well, I think you said before that you have the ability to talk to anybody who walks through the door. You take them from the level that they're at.
Well, yes. I will, when a school group comes through, I'll ask them, what's a dinosaur? And they'll tell me, and then I know where we go from there. From the very young ones, we'll talk about what's a reptile, what's a mammal, what the differences are. If we get into a more sophisticated group, then we'll talk more about the specifics of what makes a dinosaur a dinosaur. And a lot of it gets into, I think, the forgotten question of education, which is, how do you know that? It becomes a detective story. I mean, this is this list of stuff that you've somehow or other got to wrap your brain around can be rather tedious. But when you start talking about how do they discover that thing, then it gets to be very exciting.
Yeah. Well, Bill, this has been very interesting, but let's take a look around at some of the major exhibits here in the hall.
Certainly.
Bill, we're here in one of the principal exhibits, the Growlitore, and from my layman's understanding, what happened here was there was this mud, and this creature left his tracks in the mud, and then the mud became fossilized into rock, and you had the footprint to work with, in which I think you've referred to as sort of a Cinderella operation, and then you had to recreate everything from the basis of the footprint. How am I doing?
Well, that's about right. The restoration that you see here is, we don't have any bones for this animal. It's based on a different animal, something called Coelophysis, which lived at about the same time. The reason we chose those bones is that dinosaur footprints are actually fairly distinctive on the placement of their knuckles. So if you have a footprint, it's like the glass slipper, and then like the Grand Duke, you can go around to museums and find the foot that fits it, and Coelophysis had the best fit. I would hope that we're as close as a lion to a tiger, but something along those lines in making this restoration.
And I understand it was you yourself who fabricated this model based on the footprints.
That's right. It was one of the fun, this was one of the fun parts of the job. People who go into museums need to know something about fine arts, and have a modest facility with this stuff, and so it was just a wonderful project to be able to work with. I should mention here that this is a Jurassic dinosaur, and Angus and I are standing on a part of New Jersey's Jurassic Park. The Jurassic section in the state lies inside the Watchung Mountains, and these are from Tawaka, New Jersey, which are up around Hook Mountain. The eyes are taxidermist alligator eyes, and the teeth are wooden, so we might also call this George.
So I get the impression that museology is kind of a combination of science and art.
Well, in science museums it is. You really think about how people look. How do you present something so that you can communicate the information? And while I'm not an artist, I would imagine a lot of things, a lot of ideas that artists have would go through a similar process of how do I take this and communicate that to the viewer?
Yeah. Well, let's move along and take a look at something else.
Sure.
Well, Bill, one of the things I was most impressed in my first visit through your museum here was the fact that you have a sculpture done by Charles R. Knight, because he's probably the most famous American artist who did dinosaurs. I understand, like, what he did is he would make these models and he used the models in his paintings, and he has a remarkable life story. I understand he was legally blind, but he had these adaptive glasses, and at the age of only 12 he enrolled in the Metropolitan School of Art. And the way he got involved with this, I understand, was he was at the Museum of Natural History in New York, and one of the curators gave him an assignment of doing an interpretive painting of a fossilized pig. Mm-hmm. And most artists would shy away from such an assignment because there's very little to work with, but Knight was known for using creative imagination to sort of fill in the gaps. And so perhaps you could tell us a little bit about this particular Charles Knight piece. I think we're really lucky to have it.
Well, yes, this is an illustration of a sauropod dinosaur, and it sort of gives us something of the history of science. You'll notice that it's dragging its tail, and we don't have tail drags for these large animals. This thing could be up to 100 feet long, and it weighed tons, so that when you think about the physical work a dinosaur did of lifting everything off the ground, not just dragging it along like a crocodile tail, mm-hmm. That was really amazing. And originally they thought, this is impossible, so we'll restore it like we know it had to be. Yeah. And as you mentioned, when you go to the American Museum of Natural History, you see these wonderful murals, and they're just so convincing. And as you were mentioning, that's because he was going to do a landscape. He could make a bunch of these sculptures up and set them out in front of him, and that way all the shadows and all the details came out exactly right.
So he used a scientific basis, but then he went on with his artistic imagination.
That's right. Things like color, certainly these animals would have display colors, they'd have camouflage colors, but just as we saw with the growlator, where you start with bones and you put layers of muscles on top and you build it up here and you build it up there, you work backwards and you come with the best approximation you can get.
And as his fame grew, I understand his stuff is everywhere. It's in Los Angeles, it's in Chicago, and it's here in New Brunswick.
It is, and there's an art school in New York that still has his paintings, and they rediscovered them not too long ago.
And a lot of his paintings are action-packed, like the predator and the prey, and he uses his imagination to recreate their actions.
Well, there we go with the scientist and the artist trying to look for things that are going to grab people's attention. Yeah. And I've seen exhibits that weren't all that accurate. Oh boy, they got you to look. Yeah. They were wonderful.
Yeah, and he's widely reprinted in children's books, and of course that's what gets kids interested.
That's right. Yeah. It's really exciting stuff. Yeah.
Well, let's move on and take a look at something else.
Sure.
Bill, based on my layman's understanding, I find this one of the most fascinating little exhibits in the museum on account of, we were just talking a moment ago about Charles R. Knight and how he did artistic interpretations based on bones. And here we have our own Rutgers example of that. Gene Filler Scott, who was a Rutgers student back in 1977, examining these bones of an ancient marine reptile, she was able to recreate this picture, which I think gives us a better view of what the creature really would have looked like.
Well, this is really one of the fun things of doing the job, where you work with a student and you provide them information. And she really gave me a twist I wasn't expecting. And it shows you just how there's a serendipity that works for these things. You'll notice this is taken as if we had a time machine and a skin diver. It's underwater, like you had floodlights, like you were filming, the Great Barrier Reef. And
of course, this deep it would have been darker.
Not necessarily. Yeah. But in all the restorations I've ever seen, it's always a surface or close to the surface or looking up. And it's never like you had diving equipment back there, which is what's really unique about this.
Yeah. And tell us a little bit about the creature itself.
Well, this is a mosasaurus, a large marine reptile, and it goes in the category of a great many things that I'm very glad are dead, because this was swimming the oceans off the Jersey Shore. These things could get to be about 30 feet long, and we actually know that they were eating these kinds of cephalopods because we've got specimens with holes punched in them that match the arcade of the dentition of these kinds of reptiles.
Very interesting. Bill, we're here in the main exhibit hall of the Geology Museum with the pièce de résistance, the mastodon. And there's so much that's of interest here. Original set of bones discovered by a farmer in Salem County back, 1869, thereabouts. And he sells them to a circus, and somehow they end up at Rutgers. And most of this is the real thing, I understand, except for perhaps the legs, which are made of wood, and the tusks, which are made of plaster. But tell us more about this fascinating exhibit.
Sure, this is an Ice Age animal. This is about 10,000 years old. This was a cold weather elephant. It had long, shaggy hair, and it had small ears. And ears are important because that's the way elephants cool themselves. So the modern tropical forms have large ears, and these fossil forms had large ones. One of the things I think is really interesting is down below these two different tusks.
Well, let me guess. One is male and one is female?
That's right. We can tell that they're the same species because they have the same kind of teeth. And the female tusk is actually understandable. I mean, it's short, it's straight, it's worn on the end, it was used to get food. And you remember that an elephant baby today weighs about 250 pounds when it's born. And then as it gets larger and larger, the mother's feeding with milk. Food's an issue. Now the male tusks are not so accessible. You can see the points on the restorations actually come together. They occlude, so you can't use them as either a weapon or a tool. And this bothered scientists, and I've got photographs of this mastodon with the tusks rotated 90 degrees so their points are exposed. But you keep finding them like this. Well, what this was a display of strength. During the breeding season, males would compete.
Just like a peacock.
That's right.
Yeah.
But unlike a peacock, these things are very dangerous. They're heavier than a car, and they can do 25 miles an hour. So instead of cracking skulls and killing each other, they had this behavior, and most of the time they could figure out who the strongest was without having to hit.
So it's a ritualized combat.
Ritualized combat, and it preserves the animals from destroying themselves.
Which is common in the animal kingdom.
That's right. You look at anything that's got these head decorations on it. My favorite example is the elk. And every year, these males, breeding time, lock antlers and wrestle, and they figure things out, and mostly nobody gets hurt. They do it every year. And almost never in their lifetime will they actually use them to fight a mountain lion or wolf. So if you look at a triceratops, yes, it could use them as weapons, but mostly they were to impress another triceratops.
To intimidate the other guy.
Yeah.
Yeah. The legs fascinate me. Their recreations must have taken a lot of skill on the part of the carver to come up with these. They look, to my layman's eye, pretty accurate.
Well, they are pretty accurate. We actually know what they looked like, and back in the 1890s when this was being put together for the first time, there were people who could just do this stuff. They were very, very skilled. You might look at the feet and you can see how the toes, it looks like it's standing on its toes. Actually, when this is the way the arrangement of bones in modern elephants, and what happens is there's a very large fleshy pad that goes underneath, and by spreading the fingers out like that, you get a big surface area, so it's essentially lowering the pounds per square inch that's being
Distributes the weight.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah. Well, we've looked at a lot of paleontology here. Maybe we should move on and take a look at some rocks and minerals.
Okay. In this room we have the fluorescent minerals. This is the Ann and Milton Hirschhorn fluorescent mineral exhibit. The family was very generous with us and made this exhibit possible. These minerals, for the most part, come from Franklin, New Jersey, which is in Sussex County. It is a very world-famous zinc mine locality. And I think there's something like 50 minerals that come from this place that are only found at Franklin in all the world. These minerals fluoresce because energy in the form of ultraviolet light is transformed into visible light, which our eyes can see. This exhibit always gets people's attention. It's just such a striking color that it really appeals to the eye and gets people excited about science.
And most of what we've been looking at is either paleontology or rocks and minerals, but the mummy is kind of a classification of its own. It's more natural history. And based on my layman's understanding of the way mummies came about, originally in Egypt, some bodies were buried in this dry desert sand, and the dehydration resulted, perhaps inadvertently, in preservation. And then later on, towards the Middle Kingdom, they actually started doing it deliberately, using chemicals for the dehydration, and they would remove the internal organs, put them in flasks or casks. And strangely enough, the brains were considered unimportant, and they simply removed them and discarded them. And then the preserved mummy was placed inside this sort of wooden sarcophagus, which is extremely decorated and artistic. But Bill, tell us more about the dating and how this gets us in the frame of mind of time.
Sure. This mummy is about 2,300 years old, which means that this woman lived in Egypt a little after Alexander the Great had conquered the place. And so she actually lives after the time of the pharaohs, although the civilization was kept right on rolling. This came to Rutgers because we were a school of the Dutch Reformed Church at the time, and this is before Rutgers became a land-grant college. And so we actually borrowed this back from the Theological Seminary in New Brunswick. But the mummies, as far as I understand, the Egyptians really don't start to embalm their bodies until after they start putting them in coffins, because that slows down the dehydration process. I should also hasten to add that I have a background in geology and not anthropology, or archaeology more accurately. But this human element is one of the people's favorites when they come to the museum. And as you were talking earlier about the concept of time, this is one of the wonderful contrasts of how old can be.
It's a good teaching tool.
Absolutely. At 2,300 years, she's a little less than half as old as civilization, or history, which begins with the invention of writing somewhere between 6,000 to 7,000 years ago. And then when you look at the youngest thing to be fossil, that's about 10,000 years, so she's maybe about a quarter as old as the mastodon we looked at earlier. And it's a good way of people putting these ideas in perspective.
So if she is old, the mastodon is 4 times older.
That's right.
Wow. Bill, I want to thank you for your hospitality to our camera crew from East Brunswick Television. I think this has been a wonderful show for Old Ways in New Jersey. And perhaps you'd like to tell our viewers a little bit about how they can contact the museum.
Certainly. If you want to find out what our hours are, please call the museum at area 732-932-7243. It's a little irregular these days. We're coming up on the summer season, but if you call that number, you should be able to find out when we'll be here.
Thank you, Bill. Thanks so much.
My pleasure, Angus.